Okay, so hello everybody and welcome to our February Westcountry CSI webinar. To reiterate to those that have just joined us, please make sure that you're muted. And we will have a question and answer at the end of Ian's talk, so you can unmute yourself then. If you can, either write your question in the chat window or raise your hand, which is a virtual raise your hand. It should be a little face and a hand next to it, and you can click that if you have a question, and we'll come to you at the end of the presentation. So thank you all again for joining us, and I will pass you now on to Ian.
Well, thanks very much, Lydia. Good morning to all you CSIers out there. I hope you haven't been getting too frustrated at not being able to perhaps do the amount of monitoring you'd like to do. Get out on the riverbank as much due to the situation we've been living in, but at least things are looking a bit brighter going forward, so that's got to be good. What I'd like to do today is talk to you about really the background and the significance of one of the tests that most of you would regularly do whilst you're doing your valuable monitoring. So today's talk is entitled Sedimentary, Dear Watson, the Strange Case of the Missing Topsoil. So this is a phenomenon I'm sure all of you will be well familiar with. Very turbid rivers, especially after heavy rainfall events, which seem to be getting more common in the modern world. And no matter where you live within our region, and in fact within the whole country, you will have seen this, I'm sure, with considerable regularity. So here are a few images from around our region. Really, on the top left there, that's the River Lim surging through Lyme Regis up in Dorset. On the top right, that's the River Foy in full flood down near the Westcountry Bridge. On the bottom right there, a very angry looking River Tone just downstream of Frenchman's Weir in Taunton in Somerset. And then on the bottom right, we've got the River Tay there surging through the centre of Tavistock in Devon. So it doesn't matter where you live in the region, I'm sure you've seen that sort of thing pretty regularly. So really what I want to explore today is why is turbidity so important when we are monitoring rivers? Why is it so informative about the health of water? Could everybody make sure they're muted, please? So turbidity is a test that most of you will be familiar with. You'd regularly do it using a turbidity tube with a Secchi disc in the bottom, pouring in your water sample, and then the turbidity measurement is based upon using a calibrated tube based upon when you can no longer see the disc at the bottom. So I'm hoping to put some flesh on the bones of that test for you really today. So I'm sure most of you are aware that turbidity mainly arises from the presence of fine suspended sediment in a sample. Can arise too from background colour in the water, but the main source of turbidity is fine suspended material. Really, the settling rate of the turbidity in a sample is going to be dependent upon well, principally the mass of the particles, but also, of course, the flow rate of the water course, the amount of energy that's in the water course that's able to keep the turbidity suspended. The material the sediment material can be either inorganic, so essentially mineral or non-living, so materials such as finely divided clay, or it can be derived from living sources, so organic material, we might term that, such as what's happened there? organic material such as leaf debris or algal cells, things of that nature. And actually, it's important to remember that the presence of a certain amount of sediment in a watercourse is pretty essential in maintaining the biodiversity of the watercourse. So, from the point of view of sediment inputs, it's not all bad. The amount of sediment that would naturally be present in a watercourse is going to be a function of things such as the geology of the catchment and certain environmental factors within the catchment. And sediment is really a key source of nutrients in a watercourse. So bound to the surface of soil particles, for example, are things such as phosphate and important trace elements that are required to maintain a healthy watercourse. And the organic derived, the sediment arising from living sources is also an important food source for filter feeders within a watercourse. So things such as sorry, I'm getting some very strange feedback here. Things such as freshwater pearl mussels or caddisfly larvae, things like that, which actually filter out debris from the water as it flows by within the river. But the fact is, you can have too much of a good thing, and excessive amounts of sediment are certainly quite a common cause of problems in watercourses. Something to remember before we go on to look at sediment in more detail is that the large sediment in watercourses is important too. So there are very important roles to play in a river, a healthy watercourse, for things like boulders, cobbles, gravels, and large rocks. So the bedrock in a river.
Sorry, Ian, I'm just going to interrupt you there. We've just had someone say that they can only see the opening slide. So I wonder whether if you unshare and reshare again, just to make sure that everyone's at the same.
Okay. I don't have stop presenting on my screen now. All right. Okay, I've stopped presenting. Right. Is that?
Okay, so yeah, I can see it moving through, that's fine. So we're on slide 3 at the moment. Yeah, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, big stuff's important too. Yeah.
Where I was. Yeah. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see the slides changing now. What I was saying was that, yeah, the large sediment or large material in a watercourse is also very important. So the bedrock, for example, forms a stable foundation for the watercourse. Larger material provide important ecological niches for things like invertebrates. So things like, for example, mayfly and caddisfly larvae, which will attach themselves to the rocks and retrieve food material from the water as it flows past, and beneficial algae. So that brown slime you often find on rocks in rivers is mainly due to the presence of algae called diatoms, and they form important food sources for other organisms within the watercourse. The gravels in watercourses, as you would have heard in very good presentation by my colleague Giles on salmonid fish, which we had at CSI a while ago. They form important spawning grounds for species such as salmon and sea trout. The larger material in a river also causes turbulence in the flow of the river, and that's very good for oxygenating the river. And I'm sure you're all well aware that a good level of dissolved oxygen is essential for the health of waterways. And the larger material in a river can also slow the flow of the river, and in some cases reducing erosion, and in some cases minimizing flood risks. So the large material is important as well. So to take you back now to your perhaps to your GCSE geography, or maybe if you're really old, you're at your O-level geography, such as myself. Classically, you can divide a river into three main areas. So typically in the West Country, rivers rise in the uplands, and then initially the gradient of the watercourse is very steep, and there is a lot of energy in the watercourse. And this area really is where a lot of erosion would naturally occur. It's the erosion zone. A lot of energy in the flow of the river, which incisors down and forms a V-shaped channel into the bed of the river. The eroded materials then transported down into the middle courses of the river, where the gradient is still significant but getting less. And in this area we get a lot of transportation of eroded sediment, but we can also still get erosion occurring. But this erosion is slightly different. It tends to widen the watercourse rather than cutting down a lot deeper into the bed of the watercourse, generates more sediment, and this is then transported down into the lower courses of the river, where the gradient is now pretty low, and this is a deposition zone of the river, where suspended material, the sort of alluvium, becomes naturally deposited as you get down near the estuary, maybe into the floodplain of the river as well. So those are all completely natural processes. The problems tend to arise when things that are happening in the modern world impact upon any of those natural processes and disrupt them, basically. So what are the impacts of excess sediment? Well, a major one is exclusion of light from the watercourse. So if we have a very turbid watercourse, if that exists for extended periods of time, this can result in depletion of the riverbed flora, so the plants that grow on the riverbed. Plants obviously require light to grow and to photosynthesize, and if light is restricted, then they're not going to thrive, and that's going to have a considerable impact upon the ecology of the river. Sediments can also result in a lot of excess nutrient being put into rivers, things like nitrate and particularly phosphate. So a lot of phosphorus is essentially fairly insoluble. It's often associated with soil particles from the application of fertilizers and manures, and that can be transported into the watercourse when sediment enters the watercourse from runoff. This can lead to algal blooms, and algal blooms can basically choke the life out of rivers. They stop light entering the river. When they die off and degrade, they deplete the oxygen levels in the river, and basically they can be very damaging. They can have other consequences as well. Some algae, such as blue-green algae, can produce toxins, and they can also generate taste and odor tainting compounds, which is a problem if the river is being used for the derivation of drinking water supplies. Turbid water also absorbs more heat from sunlight and things like that, and as the temperature rises, the solubility of oxygen in the water drops as well. So this can really result in oxygen depletion, and that in itself can obviously impact fish populations and other life forms in the watercourse. Spawning grounds for fish, salmonid fish, can be impacted too when the gravels in which they spawn receive excessive amounts of sediment and become blinded. So that can be a major problem. And a slightly more insidious issue can be that sediment can result in the transport of micropollutants into the watercourse. So things like pesticides, veterinary medicines and things like that, which can be associated with agricultural soils, and also some quite damaging things that can be associated, for example, with road runoff, which can sometimes enter watercourses. So where can sediments come from? Well, I mentioned one there on the top left, road runoff. That can be responsible for introducing things such as heavy metals, rubber particles, which can carry other pollutants, hydrocarbons, and a number of other damaging pollutants. On the top right there, forestry can have a considerable influence in terms of sediment input, so runoff from forestry tracts, but also runoff from areas that have been clear felled during forestry operations. Then on the centre left, we mentioned it earlier, in river erosion, so erosion that results causes the river banks to collapse. This can result in a lot of sediment entering rivers. Then on the centre right there, mining and quarrying operations can often put large amounts of silt into rivers, and that's actually the River Yelm there, which has turned white due to the influence of the China clay industry. So that's been a problem that's occurred in that particular river a few times over the years. And then on the bottom left, wastewater and industrial discharges can introduce sediment. And then perhaps most significant of all there on the bottom right, runoff from agricultural land, certainly a major feature in introducing sediment into watercourses in a rural area such as southwest England. So that kind of leads on to the importance of land management in relation to sediment. It is, as I said, very influential on sediment inputs. And there's no doubt that agricultural practices have changed radically over the last 50 to 100 years with the general intensification of agriculture. And associated with this, we tend to have often less natural vegetation present, less hedges. We got sometimes more efficient drainage of land. Agricultural machinery is far heavier than it used to be. And water courses have been quite heavily modified, so straightened, for example, or canalized or culverted, all of which can lead to problems such as soil compaction and poor soil structure, which all of which reduces the permeability of the soil to water, resulting in increased runoff, excessive losses of topsoil, and damaging sediment inputs into watercourses. As a consequence, we can get more erosion, increased flooding, and in some cases, disconnection of rivers from their floodplains. So, because of that, for environmental organisations such as WRT and others, really working with farmers and landowners to improve and preserve soil structure and work towards more sustainable land management practices is a very important activity for us. And under Southwest Water's Upstream Thinking project, which I think some of you will probably be aware of, we are one of the delivery partners for that project, and a lot of the work involved with that project relates to land advisors from within the trust, working closely with farmers throughout the West Country, trying to working towards using more sustainable land management practices. So what can we actually do to combat runoff from agricultural land? Well, here are a few examples. So using buffer strips is a very important approach. So on the top left there, you can see there is a field which has been cultivated right up to the break point of the watercourse. The land is very wet, as you can see, has a slight gradient on it, and there is virtually no barrier to runoff from that land, and that runoff is likely to carry a lot of sediment. Utilising a buffer strip, which is what's been done on the right there, there is a strip of land which is uncultivated and well vegetated, and in that area of land, the roots of the vegetation are efficient at slowing the movement of water, maintaining an open soil structure to allow permeation, and all of which will not only reduce the runoff of sediment into the watercourse, but in many cases reduce losses of nutrients and pesticides into the river, which are also, of course, important pollutants. One of the major things about modern agriculture is that the soil structure has tended to be degraded because of the impact of heavy machinery on the land, and this produces a phenomenon known as soil capping, which basically makes the soil impermeable to water. So by minimizing the impact of heavy machinery, this can be reduced. So that would be things such as reducing the number of transits of heavy machinery over the land, using appropriate wide tyres that are not very highly inflated, and basically doing everything you can to keep machinery off the land, particularly in very wet conditions. You might have heard of what's known as a min-till approach to cultivating the land now. So that involves basically minimal disturbance of the soil, much less ploughing, and of course ploughing can generate what's known as a plough pan, so a compacted area down at the level of the plough that can again stop water permeating the ground, and in some cases land has to be subsoiled. So that implement on the bottom right there is a subsoiler, which can be used to penetrate, lift and break up land that's been compacted by constant transits of heavy machinery, and thus improve the permeation of water into the soil. If ploughing has to be carried out, there are ploughing techniques that can work towards minimising runoff. So if at all possible, ploughing across rather than up and down slopes, because obviously plough furrows up and down slopes can act as very nice little channels for runoff, and if possible, at the bottom of fields that have been ploughed up and down, to use contour ploughing, where you plough around the edge of the field, following the contour lines of the land, which again can encourage a permeation of runoff. Another approach is to avoid high risk cropping. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen, particularly with maize fields, just how strikingly bare they are when they've been harvested. So maize is typically harvested in the autumn, often when the weather is beginning to get pretty wet, and there is virtually no cover on that land when it's been harvested. And obviously, if that land is sloping in times of high rainfall, there is the facility there therefore a lot of soil to be lost from those fields. So not growing maize on highly sloping land would be a good start, although that can be quite difficult in the West Country, where we don't tend to have a lot of flat land, or certainly not in Devon and Cornwall. Or otherwise consider undersowing in order to actually use another crop that's sown underneath the maize to stabilise the land and reduce runoff. And there have been a number of trials done on that in recent years. Using optimal stock management techniques can also be important as well. So things like using dedicated crossing points for stock, where hard standings are put on either side of the river, so that the stock are not breaking down the banks when they're crossing the river. It's very useful. Minimising poaching of fields is also pretty useful. This isn't poaching in the sense of going out and shooting something or catching fish you shouldn't catch. It's that phenomenon I'm sure lots of you have seen, where there's a feeding station in a field. Perhaps it's hardly ever moved, or it's located at the bottom of a field, which is what's happened here. I'm sorry, folks. Something's happened here where my presentation just disappeared off the screen. Somebody else.
Got a request control.
Yeah,
someone's taken control accidentally.
They haven't just removed it completely from the screen. I don't know what's happened here. I'm just going to have to try and start it again.
Yeah.
There's a couple of times someone else has taken control during this.
Okay, we've got it back.
It's the first time they've managed to completely sabotage it. I apologise that this is a bit fragmented, but it's influences beyond my control. Okay, hopefully everybody's got that back.
Yeah.
Yes, poaching. So that phenomenon where a feeding station in a field is not moved for a long time, or not positioned in a very wet area of a field, and the stock gradually just produce a completely muddy morass with their hooves. Very unhealthy for the stock, but also very unhealthy for adjoining water courses, because that's absolutely set up for runoff. And then bottom left, actually drinking stations can be established in fields, so that stock don't actually have to enter the water course to start drinking. So pumps can be installed that actually deliver water up out of the water course to the stock as and when required, once they've learned to depress the pump with their nose. And then on the bottom right, generally in some cases restricting access of livestock to water courses, maybe initially by fencing, but perhaps by establishing new riverbank vegetation, which can have other beneficial impacts on the river as well. As you can see, it's not just I hope you can see in that bottom right picture, it's not just a question of stopping the stock from breaking down the riverbanks, but they do tend to carry out their bodily functions into the water course as well, which can obviously have adverse effects on water quality. So in summary, really then, sediment, it's important to remember sediment isn't all bad. It does naturally play an important role in the ecology of rivers in terms of the nutrient cycle, producing food sources for filter feeders, things such as that. But it's certainly true that changes in land use, modification of water courses as well, and the influence of climate change in terms of producing more intense rainfall events have resulted in more and more sediment impacting on water courses in the modern world. Sediment can certainly arise from a number of sources, but in an area such as West England, it's probably true to say that agriculture is the most important contributory factor. So reducing this by using more sustainable land management practices is very important, and it's important to remember by doing that we can get a lot of other additional benefits. So healthier soils, lower losses of nutrients and pesticides to watercourses, which has obvious ecological benefit, but it also has a financial benefit to the farmer, because clearly it's nice if your fertilizer that you are applying or your expensive agrochemical you're applying remains on the land doing its job rather than ends up in the river. Reducing flood risk will also be a beneficial consequence, and something else that we haven't talked about really today, but is very, very important. If we improve the health of our soils, a very, very important knock-on effect there is that we enhance their ability to capture carbon, and therefore work towards attenuating the evolving monster that is climate change. So I'd leave you really with one important thought, and that is a few inches of topsoil takes literally hundreds of years to form. So really what we want to do is work towards keeping that where it belongs. That's on the land, not in the rivers, and that really is sedimentary, dear Watson. So that's all I have to say. Thank you for listening.
That was great.
I apologise for the fragmented nature of that, but a lot of that was beyond my control.
Well, I know. Well, technology often has its hand in these things, but thank you very much. Jan, you have your hand up. Do you have a question? You can unmute yourself.
I don't have my hand up.
Oh, sorry.
Is there another Jan or?
No, I think it's you. That's all right. Not to worry. We'll go to Binky. Binky or Heather?
Yep. Hi. This is slightly off topic, but I know that we have a phosphate problem on the levels, and I'm wondering if anyone knows how easy or difficult it is to solve that problem.
So that's on the Somerset levels, Binky?
Yes.
Well, phosphate loss from the use of inorganic fertilizer on agricultural land is certainly a major source of phosphate in rivers, and as we referred to in the presentation there, if we work towards more sustainable management of the land and reduce losses of topsoil into watercourses, that's certainly going to contribute to reducing phosphate loadings in watercourses. Phosphate, as I said, is pretty insoluble. It tends to be associated with principally with iron that's present in soil particles. So that's certainly one thing. But another significant source of phosphate in watercourses is wastewater discharges. So and that may be from large installations run by well, in your case it would probably be Wessex Water, but smaller scale discharges from small domestic wastewater treatment facilities can also be a significant source, and also misconnections which allow things like discharges from washing machines and dishwashers to directly enter surface drains and go into watercourses can also introduce phosphate. So really tackling all of those things in unison is what I think would probably end up with significant reductions in phosphate in watercourses.
So we've got a few questions in the chat as well. So there's a bit of talk about beavers, particularly in the but I'm not going to touch on that now, because I'm hoping that we'll have a beaver CSI webinar at some point this year. So hopefully any questions you have about that can be saved for then. Rick asks, is there any legislation requiring buffer strips, and if not, why not?
There is, there certainly was a minimum, well, under agri-environment schemes under the Common Agricultural Policy, I believe there was a 5 metre buffer strip requirement. What the plans are regarding buffer strips going forward under ELMS, the new environmental land management strategies, I'm not really sure about that. That's I don't know if Simon might know that. I think
I just had a look at the new farming rules for water, and they don't actually talk about, there's no sort of blanket buffer strip, and there's nothing mentioned in terms of cultivation up to the water's edge. They do stipulate you're not supposed to spread organic fertilizers within a certain distance. I think that's 10 meters, and you're not supposed to spread manufactured fertilizers within 2 meters. There's also rules in that set of rules about how close, I think it's 10 meters, feeding stations should be to watercourses, and storage of manure, but nothing specifically about cultivation up to the edge.
Okay, well, thank you. Hope that answered your question, Rick. So Jenny asks, are algal blooms always bad, and is there anything that can be done to remove them, or do you just have to wait until they disappear naturally?
Well, I think populations of algae in watercourses are not always bad. Definitely not. They're a absolutely critical part of the ecosystem of a watercourse. But I think by definition, my understanding is that a bloom is excessive growth of algae, and in the case of a lot of blooms, that is prompted by excessive input of phosphate. And for the reasons we talked about in the presentation, that is bad. It's a serious imbalance in the ecology of the watercourse, I would say. And in terms of in a river, a river is obviously a flowing entity, so it's rather different than an enclosed body of water such as a reservoir, or so large algal blooms in reservoirs can take a long time to complete. The influence of them can take a long time to dissipate, even if you tackle the problem of continuing inputs of nutrients. A river is obviously a much more transient body, and therefore if you have an algal bloom in a river, even if it's in a slower flowing part of the river, I think so long as you can tackle the input of the nutrient source that's causing it, then I would expect it to be dissipated a lot quicker. That's what I'd say off the top of my head.
Thank you, Ian. And then Marianne says they have an issue with footpaths being on buffer strips, which means that they still get wet and they still create, you know, they erode the vegetation and the soil runs off. So there's no benefit to the buffer strip. It's not really a question, just a statement, but I don't know if you have anything to remark on that, Ian. Yeah,
I can see the point, and I've certainly seen it when I do a lot of walking myself, and I've certainly seen it, and I think probably at the moment with a lot more people out walking because of combination of that, you know, because of COVID and because of the wet weather we've had. You see a lot of examples of that at the moment. I think, though, it would have to be really bad to completely remove the benefit of the buffer strip, and you know, certainly grass and vegetation like that is durable and will recover. But yeah, I would agree there are lots of examples around at the moment where the what is meant to be the buffer strip is actually just a slippery, muddy morass. Yes, I agree.
And Rebecca, you ask about whether any of the tests measure nitrates or nitrites, and currently the CSI kit as it is we don't include nitrate strips. We do on certain occasions in certain areas, particularly if there's project funding. Some of you may be aware of Plymouth River Keepers, for example. However, it's not part of the standard kit, just because that's the standard kit that we can send to everyone. We've worked out in terms of price and in terms of the value of the tests. It's doesn't include nitrate at the moment, but if you are particularly interested in it in your river catchment, then do get in contact with us, because we can probably work out something for you. Ellen asks, how can we gently ask or persuade farmers to consider moving their feeding stations that are contributing to runoff and improve their practices?
Well, that is exactly the sort of intervention that organisations like the Westcountry Rivers Trust, Devon Wildlife Trust, Cornwall, the Wildlife Trust as well, engage in when they interact with landowners in what are called catchment management schemes, which is a sort of overall description of this type of work. So we have people who are very skilled at interacting in a persuasive and beneficial way with landowners and farmers. So there are environmental bodies like South West Water, like the Westcountry Rivers Trust, have a lot of experience in doing that sort of things. So we are the sort of body that I think can do that effectively with farmers without them feeling that the Environment Agency are going to prosecute them, or you know, the Big Brother is watching them, if you like. If you mean on an individual basis, yeah, that's I think actually speaking to us, you know, and maybe highlighting it with us might be more constructive than going out and trying to stir up trouble as it would be viewed by a farmer, if you see what I mean. I don't know would you have any views on that, Simon?
I mean, I agree with what you said there, Ian. When this has come up through CSI, so obviously we do have people reporting to us issues around sediment and cattle poaching and feeder locations and things. Yeah, our first response is, if we have a farm advisor in the area, just to talk to them, and they'll normally go and have a chat. Or in areas where we don't have a farm advisor, there might be someone looking after that area under catchment sensitive farming, so Natural England. And again, I think on one occasion where that happened, the farmer was well known to them, and they felt it was sensible for me then to escalate it via a pollution report to the EA incident hotline. So, and I did that with the knowledge of the volunteer who'd reported the survey as well. So everyone was kind of comfortable, and that was visible from a public footpath. So, you know, it's always chat to us is a good first step, I'd say. Record the data on CSI, make sure you're not trespassing, obviously, but have a chat to us, and we can sort of work on it with you. It depends on a case-by-case basis what resources, who's available in the area to advise. But I would also say that, you know, the Environment Agency don't normally, well, they don't kind of wade in with the big stick to start with. They're pretty kind of flexible, and will sort of approach farmers with the view of, you know, let's help you get this right before talking about prosecution, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree what you say, Simon. I think an important point to emphasise, of course, is there's a difference between what looks like not very good agricultural practice to what is obviously significant and serious pollution. If you see anything like that, then, you know, a fish kill, or not even that extreme, but where you can see a watercourse is in very bad state, a lot of oil in the river or something like that, of course you should contact the Environment Agency immediately.
Yeah, thank you, both of you. Nick has a question about China clay, which is being discharged into the St Austell River under EA licence. Is there a simple test that can be used to estimate clay content in the water in milligrams per litre, so I can tell whether the limit is being breached?
Well, that test would be suspended solids, and that actually classically involves filtration of an aliquot of sample and then drying your filter and reweighing it to measure the amount of suspended solid that's present in milligrams per litre. A problem that can arise is that people often equate, so you can test for turbidity, which you do using a turbidity tube, and there are other slightly more sophisticated ways of testing turbidity, but it is a can of worms. And the reason I say it's a can of worms is, like a lot of analytical tests, the answer you get rather depends on the method you use. So if there are different methods of measuring turbidity, and you'll get a different result, which depending on which of those methods you use. But also, you can't easily directly equate turbidity with suspended solids. So it is a bit of a can of worms, and to do a suspended solids measurement and get a truly meaningful result is not always that straightforward. So it's you can get suspended solid measurement from meters that you can buy as well, but relating them to turbidity is difficult as well. It is a bit of a can of worms, but you need to measure the suspended solids in the sample, basically. Anything to add, Simon?
Yeah, just that, you know, as Ian says, it's fairly simple in the sense that if you've got the equipment, it's not, you know, you don't need £100,000 mass spectrometer to do it, and we do have that equipment at Westcountry Rivers Trust, so it might be interesting to have a look at that. The other thing I'd say is that what we normally do, so turbidity is essentially an optical measurement, and there's various ways of doing that with various geometries of light being backscattered or absorbed or whatever. And you know, the turbidity tube is the same. We're looking at absorbance of how much light is absorbed, you know, transmitting from the disc at the bottom to the tube at the top, or where your eye is. Those kind of china clay particles give a much higher optical return for their weight, if you know what I mean, because they're so white. And so what we would try and do normally is, you'd say, in any particular catchment, particular sources of sediment, the relationship between, you know, a particular soil type and the turbidity is fairly constant, but that will be skewed a long way off that sort of that straight line, if you like, by those white china clay particles, which will have a very different signature. But I'll email you, Nick, about that, because I know you've been doing a lot of sampling down on the Snostell River, and it would be quite interesting to have a look at that, because I know Nick is looking at the discharge consents from Imerys, isn't it, who have a strict consent limit in milligrams per litre, and it's possible that we could provide some data, some analysis of that. So I'll email you separately, I think.
Thank you both. We're going to wrap up, but I think John Hufford, you've had your hand up for a while, so I'll let you come in with a question if you have one.
Yes, good morning, Ian. It's John Hufford from Hamilton Stream. An early slide showed some dead fish on a bank. Did science prove that sediment was responsible for those dead fish, or something else?
You mean that specific case where that photograph was
case, yes. They're all laid out on the bank there. Okay. Did you immediately say that, or did you take them away for to test?
No, that I have no idea, because that is just a random photo that I saw. So I've got no idea of the background to that, I'm afraid.
Okay, thanks.
All right, thank you everybody. It's been really great, and thanks so much to Ian for your presentation. It was very interesting and touched on a lot of points that we cover with CSI, and so I'm sure all of you found it very informative to help you with your sampling. As he mentioned, hopeful that we can start getting our full surveys up and running soon. So thank you all for your patience and your visual surveys. They've been very valuable. And I hope you all have a lovely day and a lovely month, and we'll see you in March.
Yes, thanks for listening, guys. Very Enjoy everyone. Nice to talk to you.
Bye all.